So lovely to see you all here during this winter retreat. Can you hear me? So I think many of you have done retreats before. A few of you haven't, and I always say you have to be pretty brave to come to a retreat for the first time. And it can be up and down. And the early part of a retreat is often rough. It takes a while for the body and mind to settle down. But I think you find as you continue, you notice a sense of embodiment taking place as you sit. And our tradition says that some kind of intimacy and immediacy and wholeness is possible. And that this is really our original human condition, and that we are unconditionally good. Our world is good, we are good, and we're all part of the same cloth. One seamless cloth of something completely, totally sacred and magnificent. And it's such a wonderful practice that we've received from our ancestors to practice together like this, so that we can also participate in this intimacy together. It's so precious and tender to open our hearts, to try as best we can to let go of our agendas and our habits and our routines, to show up here. So I think at the heart of our practice is this radical, intimate attention, which always has a first-hand quality that characterizes both the beginning and end of our lives. And there is no other that interferes with this aloneness. In living our lives, we become distracted from this attention. We're distracted by things. So we end up thinking our life instead of living our thinking. I don't even know what I just said. Thinking our living instead of living our thinking. Sounds good. I don't even know what I said. So this is the thing. Your true nature, your unborn nature, is always close at hand. It's as close as the blink of an eye. You can't lose it. You can't gain it. It's right here in your breath, in your breathing, in your in-breath, in your out-breath. And in this moment, there is birth and death. We are being born and dying every moment. And this is sacred. We are a part of this sacred universe. So our tradition known in China as Chan, cultivated an awakening known as Chenshin, which in Japanese is Kensho, which means to see or see this true nature, this intimate, unborn, unsullied, unconditionally good, true self, free of all self-identity. And our Chan then took a wrecking ball to all explanations, stories, philosophies, and just deconstructed everything, including itself, which is a pretty amazing feat. What I would like to talk about during this session is Chan, Chinese, where Zen came from, where our tradition came from. And I've been talking about it in Fridays with Roshi for the last couple of months. It was exactly a year ago this time, when we were in our last winter retreat, that I gave a series of talks on the Genjo koan based on a commentary and translation by David Brazier. And the book is called The Dark Side of the Mirror. And when I read David's translation of the Genjo koan, he brought in a lot of teachings from Taoism, which I hadn't really heard before in the context of Dogen and the Genjo koan. And maybe I'm not a scholar of Dogen by any means, so perhaps people have written about it before and I just didn't see it. But this time, when I read the Genjo koan and David's bringing in the Taoist teachings, it made so much sense to me. But David didn't have any footnotes in his book about the Tao, where he brought in the Taoist teachings and some Confucian teachings as well. So I asked him about it, but he never answered me. So I started going about this on my own to look into Chan. And what I have, this is just my opinion. I'm not a scholar by any means. I'm not a Chinese scholar. I'm not a scholar of Dogen. But it seems to me, and I'm just curious, that when we speak of Zen in the West, we almost always in the same breath speak of Buddhism, Zen Buddhism. No problem, really. Except there's more to this story, and the transmission of Chan to the West has involved a narrative that is really a project of cultural appropriation, in which Chan is presented as if it were Japanese and primarily Buddhist, which it is not. Now, there's nothing the matter with Japanese Buddhism. That's pretty much what has been transmitted to most of us in the West. We were very fortunate to have wonderful, wonderful Japanese Zen teachers come to the West. Suzuki Roshi, Maezumi Roshi, Katagiri Roshi, wonderful teachers. But it seems to me, partly what we have done in this transmission of Zen is we have left out a huge part of the richness of our tradition that comes from Chinese culture. And I'm as guilty as anyone. We use mostly Japanese words, Zen, Kensho, koan. We use a lot of Japanese terms instead of the Chinese terms. Maybe because they're easier to pronounce. But a more accurate narrative of the transmission of Chan to the West might be that when Buddhism arrived in China during the 1st century of our current era, it was reinterpreted informed by Taoist thought, and its more abstract metaphysical sensibilities became grounded in an earthy, empirical vision of the cosmos and the world. And in the process, Buddhism was so transformed by Taoism that it was scarcely recognizable as Buddhism at all. And what we got from this, really this marriage of Mahayana Buddhism and Taoism is Chan. But much of the sensibilities of our tradition come from Taoism, not from Buddhism. And this is not to take anything away from Buddhism or the Mahayana teachings or the Bodhisattva vow or any of these things. But why? Why have we missed, it seems to me, the richness of the early Chinese philosophy and Taoism, which was very, very old? It was so as I've tried to look into this, what I have discovered is some really just things that are stunning to me. I've started studying Chinese medicine, though I won't become a Chinese acupuncturist or a Chinese medical practitioner, but I'm studying what's known as the Neijing, which is a very sacred Chinese text that all Chinese medicine was based on, which was compiled in 200 AD. And then Taoism is even older than the Neijing, of course, goes way back. And what I have, and I'm not going to pretend that I can tell you anything that would make sense about Chinese medicine. I'm studying with about 90 other physicians that know a lot more than I do. But what I have had the great good fortune to discover, having a good mentor in this class and with these other physicians, is that Chinese medicine, as it was developed in the very early 200 AD, this would be the axial period, was a science. It was an empirical science, but it wasn't dualistic. Because they were practicing medicine, they had to have rigor because there were consequences for practicing, for trying to heal people, just like we would. And they didn't think of acupuncture as an appendage to some other Western science. They spoke of acupuncture as acupuncture surgery. They would treat people, serious illnesses, using Chinese medicine. And they still do, the people that are grounded in this Neijing teaching. So what is curious to me is that we can speak of Taoism as a philosophy, but when we're speaking about the mixture of Taoism and Chinese medicine, we're actually talking about a natural science that was rigorous, a spiritual ecology, if you will, that is an empirical phenomenology that is seems to me more rigorous than any kind of empirical teaching we have in the West. And yet, this science that they practiced was completely non-dualistic, because in Chinese culture, in Chinese language, the characters are both a noun and a verb. And there was never any ontological separation between the subject and the object in Chinese culture. So they developed a medicine and a science in which there was no separation between the self and the world. And everything that they saw and that they wrote about and that they practiced was based on seeing the world as movement, as patterns. They did not see things, they saw patterns. And what they saw was patterns that were the same whether you were looking at a large scale of the cosmos, and they didn't have Hubble telescopes to figure this out, but they were very precise about how they looked at constellations in the sky, in the heavens. And in fact, astronomers today still go back and look at the drawing of the charts that they made 2,000 years ago. And what they discovered just by observing precisely the movement of constellations, of planets, of the seasons, was that the same pattern held no matter what scale you were looking at. Whether you were looking at a cosmic scale or you were looking at the biosphere of the Earth, it was the same patterns. And so they saw the world and the cosmos as one piece of cloth, one sacred piece of cloth without any separation. And then Taoism gets mixed in with this, and if you've ever picked up the Tao Te Ching and read it, you will discover that it is one of those sacred texts that you really just can't pin down. You have to kind of read it and let it flow through you, kind of like it's like poetry. And many of the paradoxes that you will discover in the Tao Te Ching come up over and over again in our Zen koans. So I think what then is interesting is that we have an aspect of Chan which really doesn't have the same kind of metaphysical implications that come from Buddhism and India. Their metaphysics are much more grounded and down to earth. And if you want, and you can go either way. If you want to see Chan as religious, you can interpret it as primarily a Buddhist tradition. If you want to see it more secular and empirical, you can interpret it as a Taoist practice. But again, it seems to me we've missed a lot of the Taoist influence on Chan, which is really quite profound, especially the early Taoist philosophy. There's two kinds of Taoism in China, and they still are practiced both today. There's a philosophical Taoism, and then there's a religious Taoism, which is more like a folk religion. And the Taoism that they were drawing on in the Neijing and that the Chan tradition was drawing on was the philosophical Taoism. And so when the Neijing talks about their model of the universe, it's very interesting. And I used to think when I was reading about the Tao that the Tao was something vague, some vague esoteric teaching. And it's not actually. It's not vague at all. It's really precise. It's not ambiguous. It's actually pretty precise. According to the Neijing, the way they see the world is that there is something that is unnameable, that if we talk about it, we're going to end up naming it the Tao or absence or mu or emptiness or whatever. There is something outside of space and time. And out of this, there is a movement away from this source. And this movement away from the source is what the Chinese called yang. And then there's a returning movement. Once the yang movement reaches its ascendancy, it naturally returns to the source, which is the yin movement. And what they saw was that the movement of yang and yin created the fabric of the universe, which they called qi. And sometimes when we speak of qi, we might speak of it as material and energy. That's how we often talk about the universe. But I think it's probably more accurate to speak of qi as intangible and tangible. So the movement of yin and yang create the fabric of the universe, which is qi. And the qi is, for the most part, intangible. We don't see it. And the part that's tangible is maybe, 6-5%. And that's the material things that we see. But for the most part, the universe is made up of this qi, which is intangible, which we don't see. And then they taught that when the yin and the yang were in balance, they called this Shen, which is one of these Chinese characters. It's very hard to translate, but might be translated as organizing transcendental illumination. There's a mouthful. Or light. And in the Neijing, they saw everything as organized around this Shen. And when they looked at the human body, the Shen was the heart. And when the body is coherent, it is healthy. And when that coherence of the body starts to break down, then illnesses arise. And when the Chinese looked at the universe, they saw Shen. Whether they were looking in the cosmos, they saw suns and lights around which planets organized. If they looked at our universe, they saw our sun, around which all of our life is organized, around which our planets circle. And if they were looking at the scale of the biosphere and beings or animals or mammals, then they saw that Shen in the heart. And for the Neijing, the whole universe is nothing but breath. It's just an expansion and contraction. That's it, breath. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because almost all spiritual practices that we know of talk about the importance of breath, whether you're doing yoga, whether you're doing meditation, and almost all of our mindfulness practices that I know of that we teach here at the Zen Center are based on coming back to the breath. But I guess what I find compelling about Taoism, it's just such a larger story than many of the stories I get from my own culture. So now, when I think about breathing and the breath, the story I have is that the cosmos made us. The cosmos made our planet so it could see itself. So we are the cosmos looking out and seeing itself. And to me, that's such a great story. It's a large story. And I like being part of that story. That's I don't know. That's a good story. It's a big story. And I also know that when we really wake up, at the moment of waking up, there is no story. Whatever story we got gets deconstructed. And that's okay. But as soon as we do that, then we're going to tell another story about it, because that's what we do. We tell stories. So I don't know if we can get by without telling any stories, or that we should idealize enlightenment to the point where we would live without telling stories. I just don't know how to do that. I can't do it. Maybe someone else can. I'm telling a story now. So I think it's not so much that we need to get rid of stories, we just need to tell better ones. And to me, Taoism is it's a better story. And but then at the end of the day, we need to take a wrecking ball to that one too. And that's what Chan does. He even takes a wrecking ball to itself. And in the end, what can you say? Well, just go eat lunch. Enjoy your life. Really enjoy breathing because you're alive, and enjoy the mystery of being on this just amazing planet, this marble in space, this blue thing that is primarily water that we are spinning around the sun on, that has these seasons and has this movement. And we are, we're all part of the same fabric. And I think sometimes when we talk about things like in emptiness or the absolute and the relative in Zen, we kind of put them in boxes. So here's the absolute and here's the relative, but there's really no box. There's really no such thing as the absolute. That is the absolute, that it doesn't exist. And so I think one of the things that our practice can do is give us this larger context, that we are living in a cosmos that is through and through sacred and is self-organizing in some absolutely amazing way. And we are all waves on the ocean. And the waves are wonderful. The waves are the 10,000 things. We have just an amazing amount of diversity on our planet. And it's fairly complex. Diversity, all kinds of diversity. And in the end, that diversity returns to the ocean. And we're all we all return to the ocean. And in that ocean, we're all the same. There is no difference in that ocean, and that's where we all come from. It's where we all return to, and in fact, there's waves in ocean, but you can't really pull them apart and say, here's the ocean and here's the wave. They come together. And that's kind of what I'm trying to talk about in this awkward sort of way, that we are part of a tradition which celebrates the sacredness of this world. And then the other thing I discovered recently when I went back and looked at the Shambhala teachings of Trungpa, I realized that he was talking about this through the Tibetan culture. And it makes sense to me. Tibet was close to China. So they were drawing on a lot of the same stuff, because Taoism was old oral tradition, going way back before recorded history or even recorded dynasties in China. And Trungpa in Shambhala teachings developed this. Well, I don't think he developed it. He received it through Tibetan culture, that got it in some way through China, about this notion of the sacredness of our world and the integration of heaven, earth, and man. And when things go wrong when we lose our connection to our primordial world, to the sacredness of our world. Things go wrong. They go off. And when our world is not well, we're not well. So again, if you think of it as breath, and some of the stuff gets pretty amazing when the Chinese talk about it. In the Neijing, they think of the climates as, and the seasons as kind of breathing, right? So we're moving into winter, where we're moving into a season of rest, where we're contracting into a yin kind of energy. And it's important to honor the season that we're in, and to be kind of in alignment with it. And then when spring comes, there's this yang energy that comes out of the earth, and just this huge force of life sprouting. So there is this breath cycle in the seasons, and there's even a breath cycle in our planet. So the breath is healthy, the wider the swings are. I'm getting older. I also am overweight, and I have a little harder time breathing, and Sensei gets concerned because I really am not, I should be able to breathe better. And so the wider the swing of your breathing, the healthier your heart is, so to speak. And it's the same thing with the planet. The planet is breathing. There's a cycle of the breath on the earth. And when the polar ice caps melt, which they are doing, that cycle is less. It's not as big a swing. And that means that we start to see weather patterns which are unpredictable, and storms and all the things we're experiencing now. So the last thing let me just give you a quote from Trungpa, because he's just he's so amazing. Trungpa in the Shambhala teaching says, when human beings lose their connection to nature, to heaven and earth, they do not know how to nurture their environment or how to rule their world. Human beings destroy their ecology at the same time that they destroy one another. From that perspective, healing our society goes hand in hand with healing our personal elemental connection with the phenomenal world. So you see, we're talking about a spirituality which is completely woven together with our phenomenal world. It can't be separated. And so we're really talking about a spiritual ecology, and the implications for this in terms of our environment and how we are treating it are enormous. I saw a report the other day of this amazing artist that had developed, she must have been in California. She started started doing art installations, hanging plastic in galleries. She would collect plastic from the beaches and then bring it into a gallery and hang it in all kinds of ways. And then she got more involved with that, and she started a business to take the plastic and cut it all up and make it into roads, to use it to make roads. Isn't that amazing? Amazing idea. Why wouldn't we want to do that? If we saw our world as sacred, how would we possibly allow our oceans to be clogged with plastic? Or how would we allow the salmon to disappear in the Northwest? We wouldn't do that. We just wouldn't do it. And she couldn't make it work because it wasn't profitable. That is so sad. And you hear stories like that over and over again. Someone develops a wonderful technology for drinking water, and they can't bring it out into the world because it doesn't fit into a capitalist model of making a profit. But they're doing it in India. So that's what I have to say this morning. I'll come back in other talks during this retreat and try to integrate more of the Taoist from the Tao Te Ching teachings, because they're quite marvelous. But I hardly know where to start with them, actually. So we could open this up to some questions, conversation. How does this make any sense to you in terms of your world, or how you see it, or anything?
Robert, can I start and just ask? I posted this in the chat, but if you could copy and paste that quote that you just shared with us, I love that. I'm involved with the local Sierra Club out of Chicago, and
Oh,
so anything environmental friendly is gonna get my attention. That's a phenomenal quote. I'd love to
yeah,
capture that.
sure. Sure, I'll do it, Paul.
Thank you.
Yeah. I just did it.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I think, one thing I really like about that too is, this, you kind of got into the theme of this fabric and how it's all tied together. And I think this is one of those things it's a frustration for me seeing that people don't seem to realize that this interconnectedness that we all have with each other and with nature. And it's funny you bring up capitalism because it feels like it goes so much against a lot of what you're talking about. And that's a lot of what our society is dealing with right now. We're all kind of in a separate world or doing our own thing. And then at the same time, we're like destroying what is there for us. It's, I don't know. I don't have any other deeper thoughts with it, but it's very interesting to, just an interesting theme.
Yeah, well, I mean, if go watch Attenborough's documentary on the Earth, it is just magnificent. Attenborough has worked with the natural world his whole life, and I think he's about 86 now. And he just did it's kind of his bearing witness to the planet, and he felt some obligation at the end, towards the end of his life, to tell what he has seen. And what he's seeing is the disappearance of a lot of diversity on the planet. And he has an enormous sense of grief and sadness about that loss, and he's trying to document it. And then at the end, because he's I think essentially a very optimistic person, he lays out some things we could do to actually change. We could limit farm fishing in the oceans. We could actually bring the fish back in all kinds of ways. We could do a lot more with carbon sequestering. There's all kinds of things we could do if we really saw our world as sacred. So I think it's a kind of a spiritual problem as much as it is anything else. We really don't see the world as ourselves. We see it as something out there, and we don't get that that's who we are. We are, and I think part of the problem, and I've said this before, is that it's very hard to really come to terms with what we're losing, because if we did, we would have so much grief. I think it would be almost unbearable. And I think we just don't want to open that door. So I think, and Joanna Macy has talked about this quite a bit, the way that we begin to engage in some way of addressing this is by starting with our grief for the corals that are dying and being bleached, our grief for the oil leaking into the Gulf. You remember the Gulf, the oil that was, the pictures we saw, the oil going into the Gulf of Mexico? Oh my God, how could you look at that and not feel grief? But it's hard. I mean, it's hard to open our hearts like that because it's really painful. And I think that's kind of, we have a practice that gives us the capacity to bear witness in that way and have the strength to do it. So, and not look away. So, yeah. Yeah, Shishin.
Wonderful, Roshi.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Couple of things. First of all, Pat and I have done, I don't know if anybody else here has done any scuba diving or snorkeling, but when we have scubaed, we have seen stuff on the bottom that is just horrible. And we've seen, they've pointed out to us coral dying. This is reality.
It's just, it's awful.
It is. I'd like to say something about Dogen a little bit, just with respect to the Tao. The Tao is all through Dogen. You know that I'm actually, Diane and I are both studying in that course, and it's just wonderful. We just finished something called the Mountains and Rivers Sutra, it's all about nature, and therefore it's all about ourselves. And the Tao is nature.
Yeah.
The Tao is the way, and the way at that time was nature, and it was all one. It's just it was an astounding thing for me to realize that when Dogen talks about mountains and rivers are one, I said, what? No, yeah, of course, yeah.
Yes, this was happening in China a lot. I think there was a lot of the intellectuals and artists and painters and poets were all talking about the mountains, but the mountain was the self, and they painted the mountain not as something that was separate from them, but as themselves. So I think there was a lot of cross-fertilization in the Chan monasteries with intellectuals and artists. They would go and talk to the Chan masters. They weren't practicing Buddhists. They just go because they love this stuff, and they found it inspirational, and they would all talk about it,
And all those monasteries were up in the mountains.
Yes. And they took the name, and a lot of the Chan teachers took the name of the mountain as their name.
Yes.
They were on. Yeah.
Thank you.
Joshu. Chao Chu is the name of the mountain that his monastery was on. Or was it the town? I'm not sure. But yeah, you get the June and me were in Hawaii last year, and we went to this, we lived in Hawaii for 13 years, so we're quite familiar with the beaches and the ecology there. And we went swimming on a beach south of Kona that used to have a lot of fish and turtles, and it was bare. It was really shocking to me to swim in those waters. It was just unbelievably bare and shocking. So yeah. So I'm glad that, I'm not a Dogen scholar like you are, Shishin, so I miss a lot of that, but I'm glad to hear that.
No, I am not.
I probably would have another appreciation of Dogen if I read him again through this lens, but I've always thought that Mountains and River Sutra was just wonderful.
It is. And please, I am not a Dogen scholar. The more I read, the more I realize I don't know every day. Thank you.
Yeah, well, yeah. Yeah, anyone else? Annie? Hi, Annie.
Yes, thank you so much, Roshi, for your wonderful talk. I was really curious about your studying the acupuncture and Chinese medicine. And my question is, what kind of ways do you think that Western medicine can benefit from what you've learned about Chinese medicine?
Oh, God.
I mean, is it a whole huge
difference? First of all, I think what part of the challenge is that you have to put yourself in the frame of another culture that's really different than ours. And it's very hard to do that without taking our assumptions, because we have lots of constructs and things that we don't even know we have. Everyone does. And we bring them with us when we try to understand another culture. So it's very hard, I think, and I think generally in the West, we think of acupuncture as an appendage to Western medicine. Not to take anything away from Western medicine. If I need an operation, I'm going to go see a Western doctor, probably. Although right now, I might actually, if I knew of a good Chinese medicine practitioner, I might go to see them if they knew how to do this. But part of the problem is that it's the stories we tell color the way we see the world. That's what I mean by the construct. So I think it's very hard for us to, and even Chinese, a lot of people that are practicing Chinese medicine don't go back to the Neijing anymore because it's a very difficult text to get a grasp of. There's no good translations of it. I will tell you that one of the, and I'm probably idealizing this and romanticizing it a bit. I love old Chinese culture, but it's not like that now in communist China. They're using it as part of their capitalist system to propagate Chinese medicine practitioners as quickly as they can, because they're going to make a boatload of money out of it. So they've already lost the integrity of what's in the sacred text. But up until maybe 100 years ago, the Chinese always went back. One of the things that's different about their culture and ours is we tend to look to the future, which is great. You know, we're innovative. We create new technologies. The Chinese look to the past. They looked to the past, and they had 3 or 4 sacred texts that they considered to be just these perennial wisdom teachings. The Tao Te Ching, the I Ching, Chuang Tzu, and the Neijing. And they were all considered to be sacred because they embodied basic principles. And then everything else was considered to be a secondary text. There was a commentary or something about that. So they always went back. They went back to these old texts. And so I don't know. I don't know if anyone can learn anything from anybody. I think part of it is that we're telling the stories we tell color the way we see things, and I think we don't have the right story or the framework to be able to appreciate what Chinese medicine really is. And part of the problem is there's not many people really practicing it in this way.
Yeah, thank you.
So it's really complicated. And when you bring in Chinese communism, it's really complicated. It's like Westerners going back because they're losing their tradition. So Westerners are trying to retrieve it. And then you've got, talk about being presumptuous. Now Westerners are going back and trying to teach Chinese about their tradition. No, they're not going to work. So it's complicated. A lot of these people that, you know, the Chinese, they would grow up in families that had a doctor and they grew up with it. It was something they lived and breathed. It's really a complex practice in teaching, but it is a practice. That's the point. It's not just a philosophy. It's actually a scientific, empirical practice of medicine that addressed serious illnesses. They treat cancer and other things as well, but they treat the pattern. They treat the whole, and I think good Western doctors do this too. I've talked to my doctor about this, Melanie. On a good day, you know, if someone comes into the hospital and they have a pain in their kidney, well, if you're a doctor, I'm assuming the first thing you think of is about the kidney and what's wrong with the kidney. So you go to the thing, and you want the doctor to do that because you've got a pain in your kidney. But then if you're practicing a higher medicine from the point of the Neijing, and I think Western medicine would be much the same, you would step back and look at a larger picture than just the kidney. And that's what Neijing does. They look at the climate of the body, the whole thing, and try to address that. And on a bad day, when somebody's tired and a doctor's been working for 15 hours and hasn't had a rest, they're probably going to practice a lower medicine because that's just how we are. But the Neijing talks about a higher and a lower medicine, and I think it's probably not unlike that to some degree in Western medicine. But in Western medicine, we do tend to treat the thing, the kidney stone, the cancer, whereas I think in general in Chinese medicine, they treat the ecology, the pattern, the larger system. But I'm just beginning to learn about this, and I just love the principles that underlie it, but I'm never going to presume to be practicing this stuff.
Thank you.
I think if we could see the world as patterns and not things, we'd be a lot better off. we get stuck with things. And when you look at patterns, you're looking at the wholeness, the movement, how things are all integrated together, interrelated. And we're all a process of movement and change constantly. And so to see the world that way, then I think if we really saw the world that way, we could not put plastic in the oceans. We just would not allow it to happen. So I think in a lot of ways, the environmental crisis is a spiritual crisis as well. Sensei, June?
I love this idea of Shen.
Yeah.
When yin and yang are in balance, you have Shen.
Yeah.
And then this definition, transcendental illumination or light, right?
Organizing transcendental illumination. Yeah.
Organizing transcendental illumination. Right?
It's self-organizing, and it has light. So whether the Chinese, if they're looking at the cosmos, they see that Shen everywhere in the stars and the suns, and they see. They also use numerology. So when they're in these texts, they're using the number 5. They're always talking about the cosmos, and they have. I'm not going to go into it all because it gets very complicated, but they see everything in the cosmos as circular. And then they start talking about the biosphere of our planet. They're using the number 6, and they're talking about a different pattern of waves and things going in and out, closing and opening. Whereas when they look at the cosmos, they're seeing circles and spirals. And those circles and spirals are organized around Shen. Shen is at the center. And they had this term Shen Ming or Shen Ling, which talks about the Shen of the heart being healthy. And as long as the heart is healthy, then we tend to have good health. But when the heart breaks down, then the coherence of the body breaks down and we start to have illness. Right. So I think that's very interesting that they, no matter what level you're talking about, it's the same pattern that they're seeing, whether they're looking at a sun or they're looking at the human heart. And I just find that just amazing to me that there's no separation and there's no separation. We are the cosmos. Again, that's just a great story. You can't get a better story than that.
Right, so my question is for the human body, the heart is the Shen,
yeah.
Right? How do we keep the human body in balance in terms of yin and yang?
It's very involved. I would not presume to be able to tell you at this point anything about that very clearly, but what in general, what I've learned so far is that when they're looking at a part of the body that is ill or not working, what they're seeing is tissue that's not breathing. And so when they are using acupuncture, they're trying to bring movement and breath and blood and movement to that tissue. But they see the front and the back of the body. They have all kinds of correlations between seasons and breath cycles that are very complex, and they're all interrelated with the body. And that's how a good Chinese medical practitioner would be thinking, is through the teachings of the Neijing. And they're very precise. They're not, but I can't tell you anything definitive. It's really complicated.
Yeah, I'm not asking you for an answer, really, because I think this is a question that each of us really kind of can sit with, right? And try to see in our lives, where's the imbalance? right? And how do we balance out for health?
Yeah. I would say that, and David brought this up in his translation, and I see it quite a bit in the Tao Te Ching. There seems to be, it's a very feminine indigenous teaching. They talk a lot about the dark enigma and the valleys. And I think there's a sense in the Taoist teachings that there's a time and place to go up and plant your flag on the mountain, which would be a kind of yang thing to do. But then it's probably a why if you have some wisdom about the Tao, you want to go back down to the valley, to the yin side, where you receive and listen. And as much as possible, you probably want to be on the, saying being on the inside sounds kind of funny, but when we're in the yang mode, which we need to be in from time to time to get things done, we tend to be kind of blinded, and the yang tends to overdo it. It goes too far. Whereas, and it doesn't see the yin, it's kind of blind to the other side. But when you're on the yin side, you can see the yang, and you can listen and receive and be in a more balanced place. So it seems to me there's a kind of bias in the Taoist teachings towards the yin side of things. But when all is said and done, they see both as sacred movements of the universe, and they're both extremely important. The sun is yang, and without the sun, we wouldn't be here. So, but it's a good question. How do we balance these things in the body ourselves? I think part of it is just getting good night's sleep is part of the returning cycle to the source that we do every night. And and all animals do it, plants do it through the seasons. And to kind of align ourselves with those rhythms, I think is definitely going in the direction of being healthy, to be in accord with the Tao. So they have a very complex calendar with a secondary movement. And just as an example, they were talking recently about how this year in the spring is a yang time, but there's a secondary calendar that overlays on top of that. And the secondary season for this spring was autumn. Think about that. When we were moving into spring this year, the pandemic happened. We're moving into this yang cycle, and we all had to sequester. So there was this kind of autumn rhythm on top of our spring. And they think of the calendars like that, as having two, a primary cycle and then a secondary one that's influencing it. And then they connect those, they connect all the cycles of the calendar to the constellations. They even had musical notes for constellations. I don't know how they figured this out. But they experienced the whole universe as humming, as a resonance. And that there was a subtle resonance from the constellations that was affecting patterns on the planet, on our planet. They must have had people just lying around on their backs all night long looking at the constellations, because they had some pretty precise drawings of these things. And then they named them by different animals and things, but they saw all the constellations as cycling counterclockwise around the Polaris North Star. And there were 5 primary constellations that then had a note, a resonance, that when the constellation was in the ascendancy, had a stronger impact on the planet. But it goes on and on. It's amazing.
Here's something not so surprising. Astrophysicists, I guess you'd call them that, have discovered that there's an omnipresent sound of the universe. Yeah. That's a kind of a hum.
Yep, I've heard. There's an artist that's working in the Antarctic that is actually working with this kind of sound, and I heard a recording of it the other day, and it was a hum. Now we don't have the ear. We don't hear all the wavelengths of sound. We only hear a very limited number. Like a dog would hear a higher pitched sound than we would hear. So we don't hear all the sounds that are happening or resonating at any one time, nor do we see all the wavelengths. We only see a very small part of bees see something totally different than we do.
So I'd love just one other thing, since I got the,
Yeah.
I love that you talked about Shin. It's part of my name. I take that very seriously. Shin, lion heart.
Yeah, well, I'm Joshin. We're Shin brothers.
Oh, is it Shin or is it Shen?
No, Shin is different than Shin, though.
Oh, it is? Oh,
Yeah, no, it's a different character. But what's really interesting, and I could bring this up if you want me to show you, the character for Shin is very similar to the character for Chan.
Ah.
So, but maybe we could say that for another time. It's not Shin, it's Shen. But Shin means heart mind, and both of us have that character in our Dharma name. Shishin and Joshin. So I think that's probably enough for this morning, and want to again encourage you to keep to the schedule and really make the best use of this opportunity you have to appreciate your life, as Maizumi Roshi would say. Really appreciate your life in every aspect of it, large and small. Okay?
One thing, so we'll gather at 3 for full-timers to talk about the practice of immediacy that's beginning today as an option. And also, or you can choose to sit. All right, so have a wonderful lunch. Thank you for the Dharma talk, Teisho. Have a wonderful lunch and rest, and we'll see you at 3.